All right, thanks everyone for coming to learn about your well today. My name is Lisa Klein, and I am with the Agriculture Natural Resources team at UGA Extension in Gwinnett County. And this is part of our In the Garden series, which it's not actually about gardens, but we do all sorts of different topics, anything and everything you can possibly think about. And some of them have to do with some of the services that Extension provides. In this case, they'd be water testing and soil testing for fertility soil testing. And so we still have quite a few people in Gwinnett County that have wells. And of course, we have lots of folks from all over the state that occasionally tune in to see and learn about what we're teaching today. And there are quite a few people out there who still have wells. And there's not a lot of education that happens. A lot of times you just go out. You're looking for a house. Maybe you've got a bit of property and you're like, it's got a well. Okay, well, that's great. So I've got water because, of course, that's very important, right? So you buy the house, and if you have a realtor that's representing you, hopefully they do the right thing and they suggest to you that you should probably get some water testing done on it to make sure that everything is as it should be. A lot of realtors do not know much at all about wells. And so a lot of times we find people coming to us after the fact, and maybe they're getting a little sick, or maybe they finally read something that said you're supposed to test your water in your well, but they don't know what. So a lot of what we do here at Extension is about education. So we're here to provide good scientific based information for folks, trying to kind of boil that down from a very high academic level to something that's a little bit more understandable and to help you understand what's going on your homestead. And so this case, it'll be about your well. So we're going to talk all about wells today. How they get their water, how you kind of set them up, what it looks like, and what you can do for testing if you suspect you might have an issue, or maybe you don't have an issue and you just want to see if things are okay. So, we're going to be talking about aquifers and wells because most of the places under the ground where the water is coming from are what we call an aquifer, okay? And the well is going to be what pulls the water up. We're going to talk about well maintenance and protection. You can't just go, yep, got a well, and then continue on about your life because one day if you don't maintain it, you're going to have some problems. And then, of course, the well water testing and analysis. So, what is a well? Well, unintended, it's a hole that's been drilled or dug into the ground to access groundwater. Now, groundwater can be all sorts of different types of water. We'll get into that in a little bit. It's going to be basically just water that is somehow underground, either in the soil, or rock layers. And these little pockets or large pockets of water are called aquifers. So this is going to provide drinking water. So you may have a well that attaches to your house and you may drink that water. It may be simply for irrigation if you're a farmer or if you have a larger parcel of property and you have a well on there, you may use that water for irrigation purposes, for plants or for animals, something like that. And then non-potable water, so it's not treated necessarily, for homes and businesses. So you may use it kind of as a substitute for gray water if you haven't tested it. Uh, a lot of rural homes, as I mentioned, if you have property, you're going to be depending on a well system versus city or county water. And some places that have kind of been absorbed over time. Also, there's a lot of homes in and around Gwinnett County that are on larger tracts of land that were here long before the metro Atlanta area expanded to the size that it did. And they have both a well and now they have county water available in the street. And so maybe they've tied into county water, but they still keep their well because why not, right? But as I've mentioned before, wells have to be properly constructed and maintained in order to keep the water safe for whatever you're using. So, aquifers, I've mentioned that. Some people have kind of an inkling of what an aquifer is. It sounds like Aquafina, the drink, the water. They may be thinking that. No, well, so an aquifer is actually going to be a a usable amount of water where you're drawing that out of underground. So there's a couple of different types. There's an unconfined aquifer, and don't worry, I've actually got some infographics for you to take a look at. So if you're scratching your head going, I'm not going to remember all of this, I don't understand. I just want to know how to take care of my well. And that we'll get to that, but I want you to understand where your water comes from. So you have an unconfined aquifer, and that's going to be an aquifer or a pocket of water that's really close to the surface. So it's mostly going to be affected by rainwater and any type of surface water. So you might have a stream or a river or something like that. And that is going to soak down into this unconfined aquifer. That water level is going to change a lot depending on how much or how little rain falls. So perhaps you have a well, and usually these are going to be fairly shallow, maybe 50 feet or less. And in a dry year, you find that the amount of water you're able to pull out of it is a lot less. It's slower. It takes longer to recharge. And that's because it's coming from an unconfined aquifer. But if you get a lot of rain, then that means you typically have a higher water level in there, maybe more pressure, and suddenly you might actually have an artesian well. That's just a fancy way of saying that the water actually bubbles up to the surface. You have some pressure behind it. So then you have a confined aquifer. This type of aquifer is a pocket of water that is trapped between layers of rock or soil. So in an aquifer like this, water cannot pass easily, right? It's percolated. It takes a long time to get down there, and it's usually going to be a larger pocket. But basically, water can't get through this super easy, and it can also hold this under pressure. So you can actually get an artesian type situation here too, if it's under pressure, if you drill into that. And because of that pressure, you might not have to work as hard to pump that up if you're able to tap into that confined aquifer. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So here's an interesting infographic to just kind of pictorially show you what I'm talking about here. So when I said confined versus unconfined, so you see here you have a river and you have a lake, and then you have a layer of clay. Clay is usually pretty small particles, and it acts kind of as a sealer, or it seals the layer there. The unconfined aquifer is going to be that water above that clay layer. So surface water can get in there, infiltrate pretty easily. You've got the lake and the water surface there, and that's about the same depth as the lake. So your water table is going to be basically the same level as where your lake is. Now, the confined aquifer, you have to actually drill through that clay layer. That's that area that has very little infiltration, or it takes a long time to get down to that layer. There may be some pressure underneath there, and then you usually have bedrock underneath. Now, there can be clay, it could be granite. You might have pockets of water in between areas of granite. That happens a lot here in Georgia, up in North Georgia. You could have limestone. So there's a lot of different types of rock and other materials, natural materials that can form that layer, that soil or rock layer in between a confined and an unconfined aquifer. But this is basically how it lays out. Okay. So what makes an aquifer? So you're going to have different types of sediments. Now, here in North Georgia, in the Piedmont area, which is where Metro Atlanta is, all the way over towards Augusta and then down through towards Columbus. We have in that area above there, above the fall line, it's mostly going to be rock. It's going to be sediment types, or sorry, it's going to be rocks and other types of clay and things like that. Up in the very far northwestern area, you'll have some limestone, but we don't have that for most of the state, even up into the mountains. That's going to be granite also. Down in South Georgia, you're going to have a lot of silt and gravel and other stuff like that. It's very sandy. The inland sea was down in that area. Um, but basically, you're going to have these are the types of aquifers you're going to have. So, sediment aquifers, as the picture showed before, gravel, sand, and silt. Water is going to move very easily through these spaces and the particles, and you're usually going to find those down in valley areas. So if you see a river or a stream or something that's flowing through there, you're probably going to have a high water table. It'll be about equal where that river or stream level is, and so you'll have an aquifer there. Rock aquifers. So those are going to be solid rock like limestone and sandstone. And rock is going to, or sorry, the water is going to percolate down through cracks, pores, other things. So sometimes there's earth movement in the, we have some mild earthquakes here every so often. There's also fault lines, just blind faults all throughout the US, and that can cause cracks in the rock. Well, water will percolate down through there. If you get up into areas up in Tennessee and Kentucky and up into the Midwest, you have a lot of limestone. So, what does water do to limestone? Well, it can dissolve that, and so you'll end up with caves. That's one natural way of doing it. But also, you can end up with pockets where water has collected, fairly far below the surface, 150, 200, 300 feet below the surface as it's percolated down. And it can take a long time. And it's just stored in these pockets down there. So you're looking for areas like that. And so both of them can store groundwater. Um, and they both supply and store water, but water moves differently through them at a different rate. So now let's move through and we'll talk a little bit about the aggregate or the substrate, the unconsolidated versus consolidated. Again, there's no quiz on this. This is just kind of an educational way to teach you a little bit about the geology and where water moves, how water moves through, where it's stored, how it's stored in different parts of the state based on what the geology is. So we kind of can also group them by whether the material is loose or solid. So as I mentioned previously, different parts of Georgia, and again, this goes different for different states because every state has a slightly different geology. Southern part of the state is going to be different than northern part of the state. So you have unconsolidated aquifers, which has loose material. So it's going to be like an aggregate or a lot of little stones and stuff like that. That's going to be loose particles, sand, gravel, silt, those kinds of things. Water moves through that fairly easily. And it's easier to drill those wells. Obviously, think about drilling down into a coastal plain for a well, which is just kind of soil and loose aggregates or rocks versus drilling into almost solid granite. I mean, it makes sense, right? That's going to be more common in river valleys. So if you're like, say, up in Missouri in the Mississippi River Valley, you're going to have a lot more silt and sediment. It's going to be a lot easier to drill through there than if you're up in the North Georgia mountains on the side of a mountain. Then you have consolidated aquifers. That's solid rock. Okay, that's what you see a lot up in the North Georgia mountains. So it's going to be like limestone, sandstone, could be granite, and water is going to percolate down through cracks, fractures, or pores in this rock. It takes a lot longer for it to get down and percolate down into the aquifer that's going to trap that water. Okay. It requires a lot deeper drilling than having an unconsolidated aquifer. Sometimes you're going down as far as 600 feet, sometimes more. It really depends. And a lot of times it's your guess is as good as mine as to whether you're going to hit the water. There are a lot of things and tricks that people can say that they know how to do to find water, but sometimes it is just the luck of the draw. And so if we want to think about it in relation to a sponge, right? Aquifers that have more open spaces can provide more places to store water versus a harder rock that has cracks in it, right? So a sponge can absorb the water and release the water pretty easily, and those small holes allow water to move in and out. Aquifers are kind of the same way. So an unconsolidated aquifer or silt or sediments, those are going to be like a sponge full of water. It holds a lot of water. It's great at storing that, and you can get it, move it out real quick, move it in pretty quick. It's very fast and efficient. A consolidated aquifer, that's going to be more like solid rock, or you're drilling through a large bedrock, sandstone, limestone, granite, whatever. You've already squeezed that sponge out. It doesn't really have a lot of space, so it's just kind of isolated pockets of water that you're going to find periodically. You may get lucky and you may not, but it's harder and harder to find it. So, sometimes increasingly, you have to drill deeper in order to find it. So, the permeability, sediment versus rock. Obviously, I've talked at you for a few minutes now, so you're like, I got it, Lisa. I don't need any more education on knowing that a rock, a hard piece of rock, is like it's not going to be like a sponge. It's just not going to soak it up. So, yes, you're right. So, here's the different types of rocks that you've got. You've got gravels and sands and silts and clays, and then limestones and sandstones and shales and rocks. And then you got a little bit of all of that in between there. And so, obviously, it makes sense. If you've got gravel and sand, they're going to be a lot more porous or have better permeability than solid rock or solid sandstone, limestone, granite, that kind of thing. And so the top four are considered unconsolidated, meaning they just are a mishmash of a bunch of different pieces, right? And that allows for a lot of water to move per day. Sometimes people get a little foggy. They just don't understand when you're talking about water that's being pulled out of a well. That's usually mentioned in gallons per minute. So if you have a well that's very good at producing water, you may get 100 gallons per minute. If you get 100 gallons per minute, that's a lot of water. And sometimes you get a dud, and that might be a half a gallon per minute if you're lucky. Um, and I've got a little story that I'll share with you when the time is right. So the bottom four are considered consolidated formations. So rock, basically solid rock. And it takes years. It's measured in a fractions of feet of sometimes over the course of a year or even longer. It can take that. So we have, like, for instance, out west, where some of you have these deep water aquifers, there's that water that's in there has taken centuries, thousands of years longer to infiltrate down into that aquifer, and it's being pumped out at a much higher rate than it's being replenished. So there's actually some places out there where they've drilled down into the bedrock under the aquifer and have put a permanent marker of some sorts. And so now they can measure how quickly that ground is dropping, meaning how much water are they pulling out of that aquifer. And it's a lot. And a lot of that goes towards Las Vegas, and a lot of that goes towards agriculture and some of the more arid valleys. So we have to be kind of mindful of that. Out here in Georgia, it's not that big of a deal. We still get ample rainfall, but we still have to be careful about conserving water. So, which aquifer is yours? Well, you can see here that the most productive ones are going to be in the coastal plain. And that's because we have really nice sedimentary deposits, and that allows for different layers, several layers of aquifers. So, lots of big areas that can hold water. And then, of course, you have the ocean, you have the Atlantic out there. So, you have a high water table at that point. And you can see I'm not going to go into all of these here, but you can see all the different types of rock and then the aquifers that are in there. And if you live up in the Piedmont area, which, if you know, Gwinnett County is kind of just above the O in Georgia, we're kind of stuck in this crystalline rock aquifer, meaning we really don't have any large aquifers here. So we're having to drill down. We have lots of little pockets of water, but we don't have any large aquifers like you see down in the southern part of the state, which consequently is also where a lot of the big agriculture is. And so they tap into these aquifers and do center pivot irrigation. So it's a nice, readily accessible supply of water, but you also have to be very careful. We're prone to droughts here, so if they don't replenish, we have some of the same problems that we do out in the western part of the U.S. So you can see here water table versus land surface, and you see the surface water there. You also see how the water table kind of follows that. And if you're moving from uphill downhill, the water table will kind of follow that also. And it depends a little bit on your type of substrate. So you've got gravel, you've got rock, and you've got the approximate water table there, and you can kind of see as it moves through. So groundwater flow. So this is what you would see in the Piedmont area, which is where we are here in the Metro Atlanta area, and that goes all the way up into South Carolina and all the way over into parts of Alabama. So you have faults and fractured zones, and those are going to hold and direct water. And then, of course, you have some valleys. It's kind of gently rolling here. Occasionally, we'll get people that tune in from out of state. So we have kind of gently rolling topography here. We have streams and rivers down in the lower part of those valleys, and then we have higher ridge systems and a lot of granite here. So our water table kind of aligns with and is level with the surface water. So we have a handful of folks that have wells, and they might have a surface water type well, and that comes from the unconfined aquifers. And then, you also have folks maybe up in the mountains that live a little further up and have to drill a little deeper because they've got to get down to that water level, the surface water level, and or a pocket of water. So you can see here again, I love infographics. They do a good job of showing what we're talking about. So you have an artesian well, you've got a couple of them there. And you can kind of see what I was talking about. So an artesian well, just for a refresher, that's a flowing well. That's one that's bubbling up out of the surface. It might be that way all the time. It might be that way sometimes when the water table is high because we've had a lot of rain or something like that. But you can see if you have a flowing artesian well, one that's tapped into that confined aquifer because you have a layer of clay or some other type of material there that's kind of acting as a seal, you might have a little pressure build up there. And so that artesian well is more likely to bubble and up to the surface all the time if you're in a deep, confined aquifer. You may also have an artesian well in an unconfined aquifer. So you may tap into that higher water table area there. And at certain times of the year, maybe it's a real wet year and we're getting a lot of rain, and that artesian well is maybe down towards the base of a valley. You have a lot of subsurface water moving in. You may have an artesian well for a few months in there while you're getting all of that rain. And then when it starts to dry out a little bit and you're not getting as much, it kind of tapers off and you don't get it as much. So other types of wells, these are just kind of so you can maybe identify what you have here. So you have a dug well. That's one where you have a very close to the surface water table. Maybe you're right down by a stream or a river. A lot of survivalists will do this. They'll dig a hole right next to a stream, and then you see the water that kind of seeps in. Not only is that a good filtration, but it's also an easy way. There's water there, or there should be water there, so you don't have to dig very far. And that's one you could probably dig with a shovel. Then you have a gravel packed well. That's obviously a little bit deeper, and you're going through into kind of an unconfined, or sorry, a confined aquifer area because you're going and busting through that subsurface layer. You might have an open hole well. Again, that's just a big open hole. Occasionally, we'll hear of people that didn't not properly seal their well and they left it out on their property. Maybe you just bought some property that had an old homestead on it and there's an old well and it wasn't marked very well and you're walking around and like all of a sudden you almost fall through it. So this would be what an open hole well, and this is going to tap down into and may produce an artesian spring type of situation or not. It could just be an open hole, but it goes very far down. So some of these are 500 feet. And then you have a dry well. That's one that maybe due to some type of geologic issue, like you had a small earthquake that came through and it changed how the rock fractured and you lost the ability to get any water out of that small pocket, or you drained it dry and it just, it had been there for millions of years and it was small and you drained it dry and now there's nothing because there's nothing to interconnect and bring more water in. And then you have a larger open hole well, and you can kind of see the different kind. So most of what we're going to have here in Georgia are going to be fairly shallow, like 50-foot or so wells, or a couple hundred feet. And then up in the mountains, you might have some that go up to 600 feet. So how does it work? Well, you're going to drill down until you get to a reliable groundwater source. And so they'll bring in the big drill rig and they will just go down, 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 down until they hit water. Once they hit water, they generally will drill a little further through that because what they want to do is they want to account for if something happens and changes, they've got to have some measure of buffer in there in case you need to drop the pump down a little further. So they'll drill down a little bit further than what they did to hit water. And then they're going to put a submersible pump down in there. And that's going to, as you can see in the little diagram there, that submersible, they're going to put the well screen and all the other things in there and to kind of hold that shaft open. And then they're going to put the pump in there. And then that is going to be what pulls that water from that layer that they discovered the water in. That's going to pull it up to a pressure tank. And that pressure tank is it's going to have a negative pressure on it to hold it in that area. So basically, that can be done a lot of different ways. Sometimes people may choose not to have a pressure tank, but if you're going to be up a hill, a lot of times folks will have either a collapsible one. You may have a sealed one, but what it does is it allows you to run the pump for a while, fill it, and then a valve will close, and then until more water is needed, the pump shuts off. That it can get kind of expensive. So that pump is going to turn on and off depending on when that tank empties. And so those tanks come in different volumes. You can get 500 gallon, you can get 30 gallon, whichever. There's lots of different ways that you can do that. And that's why it's important that you hire a good, competent company when you're doing this so that you can be advised of, does it make sense for me to have a storage tank? Does it make sense for me to have a small bladder? Maybe if you're up a hill or something like that. That kind of thing. So here's kind of what it looks like. You've got the screen, the well screen, you've got your pipe, and then we'll talk about filters in a bit. Your well screen, that's going to filter out your sands and sediments, the bigger chunks, because obviously I don't want to suck those up into your pipe. Your pump, that's going to move your water from the aquifer way down in the ground all the way up to your home. Your pressure tank, that's going to reduce all of that cycling. So you're going to be able to hold that volume of water up at the surface. So you don't have to keep having that pump cycle on all the time. A pressure switch, that's what's going to tell your pump down there in the hole, oh, I need more. I need more water. So that's going to tell it to go ahead and cycle and pull more water up. And then, of course, your household plumbing if it's a household well. So there's different types. So I mentioned that South Georgia, and you can see here, um, that's going to be into a lower confined aquifer. And they're going to use some kind of a sanitary seal to stop the flow of water from the upper unconfined aquifer, where the surface water is, to the lower confined aquifer. Okay. And that's going to help prevent bad things from getting in there. Your filter screen, that's going to be those green lines there that kind of line that shaft, that well shaft. That's going to filter out your sands and your larger particles and things like that. And just as you can see, and we'll talk about how far apart you have to move things, you've got a little outhouse there, and you want to make sure that you're pulling from the lower aquifer because that subsurface flow can move a lot of that nasty stuff, um, through that area. So you want to make sure that you're drawing from down below that impervious layer. And then in North Georgia, so your surface wells are going to be, like I mentioned, we have a lot of subsurface wells here, 50 foot, give or take, sometimes less, but mostly like 50 foot. And they're going to be more susceptible to contamination because you've got rock much closer, or bedrock much closer to the surface. Up here, home of Stone Mountain here in Stone Mountain, Kennesaw Mountain, and a lot of other large granite outcroppings, the geology is such that you just have granite really close to the surface through most of the state, except for the very far northwestern part, which has a different geology. There's more limestone base up there. So here, you don't go down quite as far. And you have a rock base to that. So you have to be careful about contamination. And, up into the mountains, you could have a much deeper well because there you have a lot, like for instance, we have a place up in the mountains, and we're up sitting at about 2,600 feet above sea level, which doesn't sound like much, but it's enough. And we had to dig a well, which was about 600 feet. I wish I would have had the opportunity to go choose where we drilled it, but I did not. And the builder chose, and he chose badly because it was a very expensive well that didn't produce any water. And yeah, it costs a lot of money. And you can kind of pick. So sometimes there's ways of doing it. I know we've all seen the rock or the water divination where you take the two, sometimes they use straw, sometimes they use a branch, and supposedly they can walk around and it'll bend down and tell you where there's water. Maybe. You can definitely look at the plant life and tell where you have more water. And you can definitely look at the streams and see where the water table is and have an even better idea, right? So there are ways of doing it more scientifically, other than what the old timers did way back when in the Appalachian Mountains. So knowing what the geology is, you can see here we've got some schist and we've got some granite gneiss. And you've got two different rock formations next to each other. And this is just kind of a pictographic of how, like, well A dug in one rock, it can provide a gallon per minute, which is not much, right? 50 gallons per minute's pretty good. That's decent. 5 gallons per minute is really the absolute minimum you would want. But this one's providing a 1 gallon per minute, which is really not much. I mean, you can work with it. You probably would have to have a pretty good sized storage tank, but you can work with it. And then you have well B, which is right on the zone between the two types of rock. And it's going to provide 100 gallons per minute because you have it and it's actually cutting through the boundary line. So you have a more porous rock and a less porous rock, and that's a good place to put it. So you can look at the geology, and there's plenty of maps out there that will allow you to do that. And you can actually see what rock formations you have, and you can see where they are. Then you choose based on that where you think it would be a good place to put a well. And a lot of times that works just as well as going out with a stick. So, what happens when you hit no water? Yes, yes. Let's have story time. So, as I mentioned, we have a place up in North Georgia. We sit at about 2,600 feet above sea level on a nice mountain ridge. And I didn't get to pick. The builder, unfortunately, chose where they were going to drill. And they made sure that they were far enough away from where the septic lines were. That was great. But they didn't do a really good job of figuring out where the decomposing granite, because most of that ridge line was decomposing granite, where that was in trying to stay away from it so that they could drill down and hit the water that our neighbors were definitely able to hit. Their well puts out about 65 gallons a minute. So our well is only a difference of maybe 150 feet from theirs, and it costs a lot of money. And we got about zero point 0.5 gallons per minute, which is very sad and very disappointing considering the amount of money that we put into that well. We went down to about 600 feet. So the well company told us that the other option is, because their rig would not dig any deeper, is to frack. So some people will say that fracking, that's what the oil and gas industry does. You basically pressurize that shaft and you leave it pressurized for a period of time. And what the theory is that whatever rock is down there, that high pressure will cause it to fracture and hopefully fracture in your favor. So they had hit a little bit of water. And the hope was that because they'd gotten a half gallon per minute, perhaps by adding pressure to that and leaving it for 48 hours, it would open up some of those fractures a little bit more so that there would be more water available and flowing. And maybe we could get up to a gallon and a half a minute, which isn't great, but we were planning on using a nice big tank, 500-gallon tank to hold water, which would have been sufficient. It didn't really work. So we spent another $1,500 to frack and not really anything. So now we have another well share, which is a thing. So if you're thinking of purchasing a cabin up in the mountains and you're like, what am I going to do with water? A lot of communities up there actually have well shares. They'll have 2 or 3 wells in a community, and then all the surrounding homes will tap in and share the water out of that well. You, of course, can drill your own, but if you don't want to, you can also reach out to a neighbor and you draft a really quick and easy document, legal document that gives you the rights to the water that's coming out of the well in exchange for sharing for maintenance costs and things like that. So we have a couple of those. We have a redundancy on our well because when you don't have access to water, it's not really easy to stay in a nice house that you just built. So that's story time. It can be very disappointing when your well is dry and you just spent a lot of money on building a house. All right, so well maintenance protection. Let's move on. So there are things that you want to do if you're thinking about putting a well in, or maybe you're looking back at because you just purchased a house and you're like, well, okay, what do I do now? So always locate your well at least 100 feet from a septic system and from the distribution lines because why? Well, you don't want to drink poop water. Now, thankfully, water doesn't move super efficiently laterally. It mostly moves down until it hits the water line and then it'll kind of move laterally. However, you don't want to make it so that that septic line is above where your well is because what's going to happen? It's going to travel with gravity down. Always put them 100 feet at least from each other. You always want to make sure that well cap is at least 8 inches above the ground because what happens if it floods? You might be in a lower lying area and it might flood. So you want to make sure that that cap is above where you might possibly have a high water line. Obviously, sometimes you can't do anything. If there is flooding and you live in a river valley, that happens. You can clean it up. You do shock chlorination, basically. And then, of course, have your water tested annually. Extension can help you with that. We do bacteriological tests. That's probably the most important one. I talk to a lot of people each week and give them lots of excellent advice on what they should do to test their water to make sure that it's good and healthy. And this is the test that I will most likely refer you to. Sometimes I'll offer or suggest a W1 or a W2 test that just kind of looks at the mineral profile in your well and the pH, alkalinity, some other things. That one I usually just suggest as a one-time deal so that you have a good profile of what kinds of minerals you have in your water. But then every year you should be getting this, the W35 test. That's for total coliforms. That's your bacteria. It looks at both just general bacteria and E. coli. So E. coli is poop bacteria. That is not what we want to see in your water. That's actually pretty gross. Nobody wants to drink that. So you need to make sure, especially if you have a fairly shallow well, remember that's about 50 foot or less, unconfined, or one that would have more surface water infiltration. You need to make sure you're getting this regularly. Some counties like Hart County out on Lake Hartwell, they actually require that by law. So you've got to get that taken care of every year. But if it's not required by law, we do recommend you do that just to make sure that you are healthy and you stay healthy. So here's what you need to make sure you're doing, especially if you're putting a new one in. But if you moved into a new home, look at it. You want to look at it and make sure that that cap is on very tightly, as we mentioned before. Make sure it's at least 8 inches above the ground, but maybe a little bit more. You may have a well house on it. That's fine. If you don't, that's fine too. Sometimes it's just capped like that. And, like mine up in the mountains, it doesn't have, it has a rock. We have a rock over it, right? But we don't have a little well house. And that's going to be, you want it to be screened, and that's going to help protect you from all sorts of things. So surface water, you don't want insects, bugs getting in there. Maybe you're out there, you love your green lawn, spraying fertilizers and herbicides and stuff, and then maybe Fido gets over there and, it's a good thing for him to whiz on. So you don't want that. You want that area around that well to stay very clean and very accessible, which is why a lot of people choose to put it in a well house, because then you have a door, you can close that. And if we get, excuse me, some cold weather, you don't have to worry about it freezing. A lot of people will put an incandescent bulb in there. They'll have an electricity source, and they may have a heat source. You can plug in a little space heater, or you can get some electrical tape with a thermostat on it. And what that'll do is help keep that water in those pipes above freezing so it doesn't freeze. There's nothing worse, and this happened actually to our house up there, than having it get super cold. And because you have an above ground area where you have to have access to this well, it gets cold and it freezes, and then your water line's frozen and you don't have any water. So you can buy plug-in electrical tape, and you can buy, actually, it's a little accessory. It's just a little addendum type plug that has a thermometer in it. You plug that in, and then you plug the heat tape into that, wrap that around this area to keep it nice and warm. That little thermostat and that adapter will then kick on when the temperature drops below freezing, and then it kicks off when it gets above 65 degrees. Fantastic little thing. You don't have to think about it. Works great if you have a crawl space too, to keep your pipes from freezing. So there's a little bit of advice for filing that away. Don't store anything in that little pump house. Don't put any chemicals, gas, fertilizer, none of that, because you don't want that in your drinking water source, okay? And make sure that it's in a slightly higher area, so you don't want water running through there, because that can get down in there and contaminate your wells. So make sure that you properly slope the area around it. So signs of problems. Okay. So some signs of problems might be a continuously cycling pump. It's constantly kicking on. Your electric bill is going to be really high. You're probably not going to be happy about that. A drop in water pressure, maybe, that would be similar to if a pipe broke out in the street and suddenly you didn't have any water pressure. Okay, same thing here. Maybe the water has a strange odor or taste. And that happens a lot in wells, because at different times of the year, depending on the pressure and things like that, you may have higher levels of manganese. We'll have issues where when some of that water comes up from the lower aquifers and it's got a high mineral level, for instance, like manganese, when it comes up to a more surface level pressure up here, it loses a lot of that high pressure that's down there. Those minerals do what we call flock out. So all of a sudden, your little string filter, which is your first line of defense, um, it's going to turn brown and gross looking. And those are just excess minerals. So depending on the rainfall and the time of year, things like that, maybe if it hasn't rained a lot, suddenly you're going to start getting more of the discoloration on your filter because you don't have as much water flowing through the area, or maybe the water levels dropped and the concentration of minerals is higher. Particles in water, that's not a good sign either. That could mean that, some water line's broken. That could mean that in a county water line too. But you've got some type of contamination. There's a lot of different reasons for that. And then a damaged casing. So a continuously cycling pump, low tank pressure, basically, your pressure switch might be bad. Easy fix, drop in water pressure, water level drop. Why? You got a broken pipe someplace? Got to find that. Water has a strange odor or taste. I mentioned minerals, but also contaminants. If you live on a farm, then you may have a chemical spill. Another story time, my granddad had a farm and he had a large water storage tank that caught the spring water. He also had a large outbuilding where he stored all of his farm equipment, and he often would mix chemicals right there, right where the water tank was. I just can't even. So, I mean, what are you going to do? He did live to be, I don't know, 70 something, but he probably could have lived longer. Who knows what contaminated his water. Particles in water, again, surface water can, if you have a very shallow well, that might be one of the reasons why, or contaminants, somehow it got into the well. And then a damaged casing, again, contaminants in surface water. So here's some other troubleshooting: sand in the water, improperly constructed, pump turns on and off cycling, waterlogged pressure tank, white gray scale and cooking pots. You've got a hardness problem. You might want to look into some type of water conditioning system like reverse osmosis. Red staining on plumbing fixtures or clothes. That's a very high iron concentration. We have a lot of problems with that here. Oily sheen in water in containers or slime in toilet tanks. Iron bacteria happens a lot around here also. Rotten egg smell in water. Sulfur bacteria and hydrogen sulfide gas. And that happens a lot in the fall here. A change in color, taste, or odor might be some contamination. It really depends, but that sulfur bacteria and the iron bacteria can give it a funky smell too. Well damaged, a cracked casing, loose or missing cap, exposed wires. Your pump might be bad. Maybe you ran into it. Maybe your kid did when they were out dirt biking. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why. So, but unless you're super handy with it, there are plenty of companies that you can hire to come out and take a look. So if there's a problem, then you have to start figuring it out, because when you don't have water, that's bad. And you don't want to get sick if you still have water, but it smells bad or tastes bad. So then you got to figure out, when did it start? Did it start 2 months ago? Did it start 2 weeks ago? Did it start 2 days ago? What happened recently? Did your child run into something with the dirt bike? Did you back over something that you weren't supposed to? Is it in a protected area? Do you have a nice little house for it? Or is it just kind of over under a rock and somebody backed into it? Where's your septic system? Did the person who owned the house before you not have a clue and put it too close together or downstream? You have to kind of figure that out. If you're having issues, you can always reach out to us at Extension. We're happy to try to figure things like that, help you figure that kind of stuff out. Here's some possible problems and the distance they should be. Don't try to take a picture, make a copy or whatever. As always, I'm happy to share the slide deck. So when we get to the back slide, it'll have my email address on there. Feel free to email me and say, hey, I would love a copy of your slide deck. Thank you so much. And I would be happy to share it with you. And it's recorded. It goes to our Metro Master Gardener YouTube channel. So you can go back there and watch it again if you got to something and you're like, what did she say about unconfined aquifers? I don't remember. Yeah. So you can always go check that out. All right, so proactively protecting your well, the things that you should be done. Now, I do repeat some things, and that's because I don't want to see bad habits. So these are things you should proactively do to protect your well. Never allow that septic system uphill from your well because gravity, and make it be at least 100 feet. Always protect your wellhead. Put a rock over it. Put it in a little well house. Do something. You got to protect it. Never store chemicals. I see this. Don't do it, people. Yes, it's a little shed, but it is a shed with your drinking water. Don't put that stuff in there. Either put it in your garage or put it in your other shed that's supposed to have that stuff. Keep waste materials away from the wellhead. If you have cows, if you have horses, sheep, goats, chickens, whatever, don't let them roam around the little house where the wellhead is. Please don't do that. Exclude them from that area, okay? Because that manure can get in there and then you're going to get sick. So please keep waste materials and that goes also for the septic tank, but keep them away. All right, reactively protecting your well. So if you have a problem now, or you're looking at your well with more of a critical eye at this point, what should you do? Well, you can do a filter system and test the water every year to see what's going on. But first, test it to see what you should get. There are a lot of different types of filtration systems. There's primary, secondary, tertiary, and then there's all sorts of categories under that. I am not going to go into each of those. We don't have the time to talk about that. That is why you would hire a professional to come out, test your water, and then discuss your options. And you can also go do some informational searching on your own. I've put the QR code here that will take you to our soil and water lab. It's on several of the slides coming up also, and you can go there. And there are a ton of publications on all sorts of things, well related or just water related. You can learn all sorts of good stuff by going and reading those publications. So if there's a problem, it's probably sediment, it's going to be bacteria maybe, or minerals. Those are going to be the three things that you're going to have problems with. Testing for water quality is a very good publication to kind of get you started. And yeah, definitely go check that out. So sometimes it's as simple as just lowering your pump depth. Remember, I said that sometimes the water flow changes, and that can be because of a drought, that can be because of earthquake activity, seismic activity that's changed some of the layout down below geologically. But you might have to drop your pump a little bit. No problem. As long as you still have the depth there, that's why they always go a little deeper. You may also have to treat the water, and if that's the case, then you might look into a secondary or a tertiary system. So here are some things that you might run into: excess iron and manganese, hydrogen sulfite and sulfate, arsenic. Yes, we do have that here in our water. Lead and copper, we have that also, and coliform bacteria. That's fecal coliforms bacteria. You don't want that in there, so you might have a UV or type of disinfection system. So this is just kind of a quick rundown of what it is. You can see the circulars there, and you can use that QR code right there to take you directly to the page on the Agriculture and Environmental Services Lab, and they have all those circulars on water right there for you that you can read and get all sorts of good education. So quickly, how to abandon. What do you do with an abandoned well? Well, you don't just board it up and leave it because somebody may come, 10 years down the line and fall into it. We've heard of that happening. So if you have a temporarily abandoned well, is going to be one that hasn't been used for at least a year. Permanently abandoned, unused for 3 years. And what you want to do is you want to restore a barrier in there, and that could be something like concrete. There's other things that you can do. You can backfill with gravel to minimize any contamination, because that's an open line to contamination up above. You don't want to contaminate the groundwater down there. You want to remove that physical hazard. You don't want people falling in there. That happens. We've heard it. Was it baby Jessica? She fell in there. And you want to return or restore that stability to the land surface. And also liability. You don't want to get sued because somebody fell in there. So you can actually use that QR code. It'll take you to the Georgia Department of Public Health in their wells section, and you can read about how do you deal with an unused well and how do you properly abandon it. Why testing it? So we're wrapping it up now, folks. So again, testing your well needs to be something that you do for your health, and it needs to be routine. There's lots of stuff that can affect your well. And just because it tests well this time doesn't mean that you might not have some contamination next time. So there are chemicals that are colorless, odorless, and tasteless. You don't know they're there. Radon. Okay. Yeah, you have radon in you can have it in your basement, but you can also have it in your water. And you don't want that off gassing in your house. So if you have a well, it's very important that you consider testing for that, right? Radon is one that you only have to test once for. E. coli is one that we do recommend you test yearly for, right? Pathogens. So, what if it is in a cow pasture because somebody decided they wanted cows and the only place to do that was around the well house? Well, you can get cows that have parasites. You can also have sheep that have parasites, and that can get in there. You don't want that. You also don't want Cryptosporidia. You also don't want Giardia. There's a lot of gross stuff. I've had Giardia. You do not want it. It is not fun. No. And then nutrients. So sometimes that's not always visible. Nutrients would be like, fertilizers and things like that. And then sometimes it's sediment, which isn't always easy to filter. Usually your first line of defense is a string filter, and that can catch a lot of particles that are a larger micron or a larger size, but it may miss some. Here's some of the icky things that you might find in there. You might have viruses like hepatitis A, rotavirus. You might have bacteria, Campylobacter, E. coli, Shigella, Salmonella. Yeah, none of those. You don't want any of those. They all make you sick. Protozoans, Giardia, Cryptosporidium. Giardia, story time. I caught that on the Chattahoochee River. I used to be a fisheries biologist for Department of Natural Resources. And all it took was one little splatter of water that flipped up into my mouth, and I had Giardia. And it is not fun. It's hard to diagnose also. And then, of course, there's other things like arsenic, gasoline, VOCs, nitrates, selenium, radon, that kind of stuff. And then when should you test your well? Well, test it every spring. Just make it a habit. Do it in the spring like you would test your soil before the first time you use it. So if you get a new well, if somebody is pregnant or nursing, if you have known well problems in the area, if there's been flooding, definite flooding, land disturbances, if they're putting a subdivision in up the road, get it tested. After you repair a part of your well system, you replace that pump, test your well. If you notice any changes in taste, color, or odor, and then if your household plumbing contains lead. If your house was built prior to 1986 and you have not done any changes to your plumbing system, there is a possibility you have lead pipes. So if you have lead pipes and you have a well in the Piedmont area, especially in the Metro Atlanta area, we tend to have more acidic water. So the pH scale, 7 being neutral, anything above to 14 is alkaline, anything below that is acidic. If you have a well that has a 5 or 5.5 acidity pH, that can leach that lead off your pipes. It can also leach the ions off of copper in your water heater. And yeah, you're drinking that. So it's very important that you at least get a baseline for what you have in your mineral and pH profile, and also to know just what's going on in there. So get them all when all of these happen. All right, this is just a well water report, just so you can see what it is. I know it looks a little intimidating. Don't stress about it. It's basically showing your EPA maximum levels. You can see that there. And then your sample, which is right next to that. If it's highlighted in red, that tells you it's too high. Okay. And so if you do that as a baseline because you just got a new well or you dug one or you bought a house and it had the well and you see some of that stuff, don't freak out. It's okay. But do consider getting a some type of a water purification system. And again, those publications are your friends. You can do some reading. It breaks it down for you really simply. Extension articles are fantastic for that. They do a great job of educating without making you go, "What? I don't understand." And then you know if you need to go ahead and hire somebody to come out and put a filtration system on. And so I'd like to thank the authors of this particular uh, program that I did. I actually took it and kind of sliced it and diced it and did a little um, upgrade on some of the images and made it a little bit simpler and easier to understand. But these folks are great. Actually, Dr. Gary Hawkins was the one who was kind enough to give me the PowerPoint here, and he's a great guy. He's got his hands in lots of good stuff. And most Dr. Saha, love him. He's over at the water lab. So if you have a water sample and it goes over there, Dr. Saha will probably be one of the ones looking at, especially if it's a bacterial sample. And so that brings me to the end of my presentation here, learning about your well. So if you have any questions, and there'll either be questions or I've completely stumped you, and that's okay. I didn't mean to stump you, but if you have questions, I'm happy to take any questions if you have any. Um, if you don't, that's fine too. If you would like a copy of the slide deck for just your informational purposes, you can email me there at the lisa.klein@gwinnettcounty.com, and I'd be happy to share that with you. I am recording this, and it will go up on the Metro Master Gardener YouTube channel. I do have like three or four in queue right now that I've uploaded, but I got to do some editing on. It's been absolutely crazy busy as it is usually most every spring here. So I just haven't had an opportunity to do that. Um, but anyway, so if you don't have any questions, then that's pretty much it. And I appreciate everybody showing up to learn about your well. I know it's not quite as exciting as learning about hydrangeas or something like that, but you're a little bit smarter now knowing about your well and what makes it tick and how all that water moves around subsurface. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and I will bid you adieu. So till next time, thanks for coming.